Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page, the show from the Racing Post that takes you deeper into the stories that matter. I'm Racing Post editor Tom Kerr, and I'm delighted to be joined today by senior reporter Chris Cook and writer and broadcaster Maddy Playle. Regular viewers of this show will note we have a new look, but the format remains reassuringly similar. Each of us will take it in turn to introduce the story which we think was the most important from the prior week. We'll discuss why we think that's the case, and we'll debate what might happen next. At the end of that, in a process which is almost as objectionable as the way this country will pick its next Prime Minister, I will arbitrarily decide which story was the most important and deserves to go on the front page. So kicking us off this week, Maddy, what's your most important story of the week?
Yeah, my story is basically talking about Rob Hornby. Of course, he won the Falmouth and July Cup double with Prosperous Voyage and alcohol free. The first jockey to do that since 2004, that was Johnny Murtagh, who did it back then. But I'm going to take this wider. Yes, it's fantastic to see Rob have such an incredible Group 1 double, especially after what he's been in the news with, losing the ride on Westover in the Irish Derby. But also about the nature and the sort of community of jockeys and how fickle it really is riding these top class horses. I mean, Rob, for instance, wouldn't have even had the ride on either of those horses in a normal year. Oisin Murphy would have took the ride on alcohol free if he wasn't banned, and Frankie Dettori, if he hadn't resumed with John Gosden, would have been aboard Mark Chan's Prosperous Voyage. So it just shows how so many things have to go right in order for jockeys to even get these chances, let alone succeed on them, and we know the multitude of factors involved there. And Tom, you mentioned it when we were talking about it earlier. Is there another sport where you have so little job security? You know, there's not contracts involved in these big relationships. There's no guarantee that you're going to be in a job day to day. Even someone like Frankie Dettori, who's one of the most established riders that we have, his agreement with John Gosden was merely informal. And then you look forward and you look at the moment we're seeing so many promising apprentices coming through. I was at Ascot on Friday and I spoke to Harry Davis, who rode a winner for Godolphin. He's currently flavour of the month and he's riding for so many different people. Andrew Balding, a key supporter of his, but a lot from Charlie Appleby and lots of other trainers too. And he sort of said, I have so much to learn, and I don't want this to go too fast. Now, we know how jockeys struggle when they lose their claim, and he was very grounded in that he just wants to enjoy it and take it step by step. And I think for jockeys, even Rob Hornby, is there any guarantee that he's still going to continue on this upward trajectory? You know, when the likes of the Frankies and when he's back, Oisin's are around, they have such a big profile. It's almost to an owner, they have real substance behind them if they have one of these big names. And Rob's done such a fantastic job and he clearly deserves these opportunities, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get them. Such are these relationships at play and these power dynamics between all the different members in the industry. I think it's a really, really interesting thing. Given the effort that jockeys put in, they're riding out in the mornings for free and the impressions they have to make, they're constantly under this pressure to sell themselves. I wonder if in future we'll see a change of that. At the moment, it's owners who have the power. We were talking about a couple of weeks ago, Holly Doyle and Imad Al Sagar, and that's a great retainer that's provided her with a first European Classic winner, and without it, she probably wouldn't have had it. So I just find these relationships very interesting, and I wonder how they're going to develop when some of the older guard bow out.
Yeah, it's sort of fast fashion among owners, isn't it? Your flavour of the month one day, but then 6 months later, the wheel has turned, and suddenly the jockey who yesterday was getting snapped up by every owner who naturally want the best in their horse, or what they perceive as the best, perhaps more accurately, and they've moved on to someone else. Is there another job as challenging or as insecure in modern Britain, or indeed in modern sports, as being a jockey?
Oh, definitely. I mean, journalism is terribly fickle business. If people only knew what we go through. So this is kind of the second time this has happened this summer, because we had Richard Kingscote win the Derby, didn't he? Because Sir Michael Stout and the owner Saeed Sahil,
is he definitely going to retain that ride?
Oh, that's another question. Don't open up things. That's not where I was going. But I mean, so I'm remembering, when he lost the ride on Brown Panther going to St. Leger, and connections sort of got to the point where we got a chance in a classic race, and we got a jockey who hasn't won one of these, and I'm not sure even how many chances he's had. So they went another way. They went with someone more experienced, a name jockey, and it didn't work out. But years later, here he is winning the Derby. There are lots of jockeys who would be good enough for these chances if only they were given them. But you never get to find out unless somebody's sort of brave enough to give them the chance. And so here it was the same with Rob. He lost the ride on Westover that went and won the Irish Derby. Any of us around here could have probably won on it that day. And I'm just so pleased for him that he's got his chances in the end. There's no law that it had to happen. There must be plenty of talented jockeys out there who didn't get the break that he's just had over the past week. And the great thing for him is he's done it in consecutive days and got way more attention than if it had just, I bet there's a few jockeys who've ridden a Group 1 winner and they're maybe even watching this now going, I didn't get anything like this much notice when it happened to me. Well, that's it. But now everybody knows he's a Group 1 winning jockey.
It's a narrative as well that built up, isn't it? Because of he lost the Westover ride, people are now more inclined to almost put weight behind him and support him because we feel great that he's managed to do it.
Well, there'll be owners out there now saying, I want Rob Hornby on my horse, which probably wouldn't have been the case, no disrespect to Rob, a little a few weeks ago. Like you say, all of this happening within a sort of 5-week period has effectively acted as a magnifier for the story, and we as journalists know that, a redemption arc is a classic narrative, isn't it? Yeah. But it means that Rob's talent's been noticed and ultimately it's worked out well. But I'm always fascinated by these wafer-thin margins in sports, It's the free kick that clips the edge of the post rather than the inside of the post and goes in. And on that margin, turns a game or turns a career, and this is really it, isn't it? Rob Hornby, having lost in the Derby and then lost a ride, that could have been his career, the defining moment. But he's had this fantastic weekend, 2 Group 1s, and perhaps that changes the trajectory of a career, of a life. Yeah.
And you talk about Richard Kingscote. I mean, it wouldn't have taken an awful lot, I don't think, speaking generally, not necessarily in his case, for him to turn away from the sport in those couple of years where he didn't quite have that strong relationship with Sir Michael Stout and perhaps wasn't getting the rides for Tom Dascombe either. And the pressure that they're under every day, Rob Hornby has not had to wait too long for his redemption. Some jockeys go their whole career and then they still never get it.
So should there be more security for jockeys? I know this is sort of hugely controversial.
Do you think that leads to the sort of the mental strain of it? We often talk about the ups and downs, but to not have the security of knowing when your income is coming, obviously that comes naturally with the whole freelance thing. I
just don't think it's the line of work that you get into if security is your number one. It's any kind of gig as a professional sports person, you're taking your chances.
You say that, but in most other sports, there is more security, whether it's contractual or long-term agreements, sponsorships, etc. Jockeys would be fairly anomalous in the sense that they can sort of, on one day, be retained jockey for someone, picking up rides, some of the best rides in the world, and the next day, with very little recourse, have sort of lost all of that and have to start again.
Yeah, I mean, they must be a bit like tennis players, I suppose, in that sense. They're completely on their own. You've got no team structure around you. What's so interesting to me is that so many jockeys say this. When one of these things goes wrong and you lose a job or you lose a ride, the thing you mustn't ever do is lash out and tell the person what you really think of them. Because, if you look what happened to Davy Russell, and he wasn't in dire straits anyway, but he lost the Jigginstown gig and was sort of cool about it, and then, it was hardly any time later.
Twitter profile, love a cup of tea or something. I love that.
There you go.
Right. Make an asset of it, actually. The legend grows in the retailing.
The wheel turned again, and there he is winning on Tiger Roll and other horses. So.
And I do think that's the beauty of our sport, and Tom, you talk about these thin margins, is that whenever there's a loss, there's a gain. So someone might have missed a ride, but it might mean someone else can use it to their advantage, and that's a really fascinating dynamic in racing, I think.
Agreed. So, just to wrap this one up, Rob Hornby, does he go on from here to become one of the biggest jockeys in the country?
You need more chances for that, but I think he's on easy street in the sense that no one is ever going to be able to say, well, this guy hasn't done it. You know, he's done it now, and we all noticed it. And you know, if ever a Group 1 comes along when you need a jockey, and the trainer says, well, what about Rob Hornby? You know, there's no one who's going to say, no, I don't want that guy. You go, oh yeah, he had that big weekend. Yeah, let's use Rob Hornby. So yeah, he's in a completely different situation now, I think.
So, story 2, we're coming to you, Chris, and you were picking up a really interesting column you wrote last week. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so I went along Wednesday night at Kempton last week it was the Women in Racing AGM, where they launched this new initiative called Racing Home, and of course, you know, being racing, we love new websites, racinghome.org.uk if you go there. The idea of this website is it's offering support to women in racing mostly, but parents in racing generally, who would like to continue working in the sport after they've had a child. And you know, it's a fair point. This is something I think that the sport has never really turned its attention to in a concerted way. So that website aims to provide lots of help to employers as well as employees, advising about, you know, your rights in this situation or your obligations, and offering help to women that find themselves in that situation. And it's got the sort of full backing from NARS, the Stable Staff Association. They've got some very interesting people there who've lived this situation. There's one woman who was talking to me about her experience of working in the sport for 15 years. She's been a single mother all that time. And she says, you know, it's really not necessarily a sympathetic environment. There are stables where things are done in a very supportive way and absolutely the correct way, but there are lots of others where, you know, you're sort of left to fend for yourself and things are made difficult for you. You're treated less well when you come back to work because you're asking for a bit of support in terms of the hours that you're available to work. And probably, you know, if you've had a difficult birth of any kind, you're not able to go straight back in taking the sort of physical strain that you were used to, you know, when you were sort of 5 years younger. Racing Home is sort of setting up, let me see if I can get it in my story, new sort of support, physiotherapy at the Injured Jockeys Fund, 3 centres for women who are returning to birth returning to work after doing this. And so it's just, the idea is we're going to help people to stay in the sport when otherwise they might well have drifted away. And it's an easy win, it seems to me, for horse racing because, you know, the only thing we've been talking about for about years is the staffing crisis. Yeah. And here's a way of keeping people who want to work in racing and we'd really like to stay around but have found it difficult in the past, you know, this particular group of people.
There's a few things that we need to resolve there. There's obviously the support, which this is tackling. There is a financial element to it as well. But the thing that struck me most about that column was, you know, some of the attitudes. And I think, you know, to be fair, we should stress that there's a range of attitudes in the industry. But one quote, the quote you began the column with, classic column writing, Chris, very striking quote, grabbed people immediately, was, "What have you done that for? You're ruining your life." Extraordinary.
Yeah, amazing stuff. And the same woman talked to me about, you know, being told that she was a slacker when she came back because she didn't want to turn up necessarily for first lot every morning and ride 4 lots, you know, when she's had to sort of get 2 kids off to childcare. That morning, there's basically a complete lack of sympathy. You can understand it's a very laddish culture among stable staff. And that's one of the things that has to change, you know. And so Racing Home is sort of aiming to spread greater understanding of the difficulties faced by people in this situation so that you don't have to put up with that kind of, what would you call it, hazing? You know, the sort of low-level stuff, which maybe even an employer isn't directly responsible for. But you have to take control of the culture. It's
form of bullying, really.
Yeah, and you have to sort of make sure that all your staff are having a good experience when they come to work, and that's how you keep people around for decades.
Yeah,
sorry, go on, Tom.
I was just going to say, let's put it in context, Maddy. The retention rate, or rather churn rate in stable staff in 2018 was just over 1 in 5 per year. So 1 in 5 roles, it becomes vacant each year. Now, actually, that sounds really bad, but it's actually not a huge heap worse than the national average. I think the difference is that racing has a very specialised skill set. It also has some distinct physical requirements, and therefore racing could probably ill afford to lose people through it quite so rapidly. You know, Maddy, what do you think racing ought to be doing on this, and indeed other areas to improve the retention of stable staff?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is, firstly, I think this is great. And well done to Chris for shining a light on it, and it's something that definitely needs our attention, because you talk about retention of staff. Often we're talking about the lack of stable staff, the demanding nature of their job. So if people can now feel, actually this is a working environment where I can go away, have a child, and I want to come back. I was at a stable the other day and I was speaking to a young woman who said she worked in racing, went away for a bit to try something else and came back. That just shows you how this job is really about the love for the horse, and people struggle to stay away. And I've heard lots of similar stories. She didn't have a child and a new family to deal with. And this is clearly, these people need more support. Chris, we were talking before, I think there's a code of conduct.
Yeah, in the works, a new code of conduct for trainers that the BHA have, they're going to put it into the public domain sometime in the coming months, and we don't even know yet if this subject is going to be addressed in there. Maybe it will. So yeah, that would be something to keep an eye on.
That would be important, wouldn't it? And you say about how the website sort of offers support and guidance, and I think that's the first step. The next steps have to be maybe some sort of framework that can be put in place for trainers. But obviously it depends on the size of the business, as we were discussing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, lots of trainers, you have to have sympathy for them. They may not have employed someone who's been through this, so they may not know, the rights that they have to respect. They may not know the right thing to do. So again, if you go to this website, there's all sorts of suggestions about what best practice would be. And I think the idea at NARS is very much to sort of help the industry move forward together. They're trying not to turn this into a whole confrontational thing about, picket lines and yelling and finger pointing and saying, you didn't look after me. The people who work in racing are just natural enthusiasts for this kind of thing, and it shouldn't be that difficult to sort of keep them around for the whole of their working lives. We've just got to make sure that there's no obstacles being thrown in the way of people who start a family, which, at the end of the day, we're sort of, as a country, we're relying on some people at least getting on with that.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? I think a lot of people see, getting pregnant as then a ticket out of the industry, perhaps, to then move on to try something else or to do something else. So we need to, whether it's, the way that they are made to feel when they're working, or, more stronger measures taken to support them, we need to make it clear that actually, no, you can return, and this is the right industry to do that in.
I think one of the things we're seeing, over the last few years with the shortage of stable staff is some big questions being asked about the nature of that job, how it looks. Because I think it would be fair to say that a fairly healthy flow of overseas stable staff in the past sort of meant that there wasn't a huge amount of thought given to making this a rewarding and fulfilling long-term career. But now, the more forward-thinking trainers are thinking about exactly that. And so they're thinking about things such as time off, weekends, and indeed family working. And anything that ultimately creates a stable staff job, which is more suited to the modern world that we live in, has got to be good for the sport, because not only are you going to alleviate some of the pressure on stable staff, but you're ultimately going to get a more highly skilled staff in the long term. That's to the benefit of everyone.
And I suppose the reality in a place like Newmarket is that these trainers are competing with each other for staff, aren't they? So I mean, if maybe one way to make yourself more attractive as an employer is to sort of be very careful about sort of respecting people's rights and giving them the support that they need in these situations.
I was going to say exactly that. I've spoken quite a lot to the Kublers recently, Dan and Claire, who train, and they won a license award. And they basically said that they had lots of staff joining them from other trainers because they had that backing behind them, and that made them more attractive. So I think you're spot on, Chris. It's a competition level, and we can force the standards up, if you like.
So guys, my story this week is about summer jumps, and we've had several stories on it in the newspaper through the week, beginning last Monday when Fergal O'Brien, who's obviously one of the major beneficiaries of summer jumping, said that he thought the schedule should be reduced. And this is coming off the back of the news that well over a quarter of races, for the first time since '95, when our data begins, had 5 or fewer runners than them in June. The field size was a record low of just under 7, And to add further context, until 2011, the field size for the comparative period had never been below 9. So later in the week, we also had bookmakers saying that they thought there was too much summer jumps. And the most fascinating thing I thought was a column produced by our colleague Craig Thake, which had a table with it, which showed basically how field sizes and summer jumps correlates with the number of meetings. And basically this table shows that from 1995 through to around 2010, the field sizes held pretty steady, pretty healthy field sizes as the summer jumping schedule expanded. Then 2011, as the summer jumping schedule reached its height of just over 50 meetings, the field sizes started dropping. And they've never stopped dropping since, basically. And we've come to today when summer jumping is in a pretty dire state. The trainers who are beneficiaries of it don't really want it. The bookmakers don't really want it. And I think it's fair to say, based on the reaction to our coverage, no one among racing's fans and punters would be that sad to see the schedule trimmed as well. So it seems a pretty open and shut case to me. There's too much summer jumping, so why don't we cut it? Well, we all know the answer to that, because you can't do anything in this sport. And I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record here, guys, because there's a certain similarity to last week. But I think it's hard not to draw a comparison between racing's leadership and Boris Johnson holed up in number 10, not doing anything, not saying anything, and ultimately achieving nothing. Because racing's leadership knows what the problems are. There's been 12 years in which you could see this trend developing. So that's just for starters. So why on earth are we now in a situation where we are looking at a situation where everyone agrees there should be less summer jumps, apart from the race courses, and we're not going to get anything done because every question just gets rolled into, well, we're working on a long-term strategic review of the sport. But of course, on the point of the long-term strategic review, we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't have any timetables. We don't have any frame of reference for it. And above all, we don't have any answers as to how this strategic review will overcome the thing that bedevils everything in racing, which is self-interest and the power of veto. And if we know, as we do, that the race courses are going to resist tooth and nail any attempt to cut their schedules, then are we actually going to achieve anything even after this strategic review comes? So what can be done, Chris?
Well, I guess there's got to be some give and take. You know, if people are going to, race courses are going to give things up like fixtures, you have to find a way of making them feel good about it. You know, maybe moving the fixture into the winter period for some tracks, that might work. There are some like Cartmel and I guess Newton Abbot would be another that are just really set up for summer jump racing. And that's why I would sort of be inclined to resist any sort of absolutist talk of a cull. You know, let's just stop racing at the beginning of June, start again in the end of July like we used to, and, you know, jump jockeys can all spend 6 weeks doing something else, a bit of bricklaying, or, you know, if they've made enough money, they can go and lie on a beach. I don't think we're going back to sort of how it was in the 80s. You know, also another thing I think the sport generally finds attractive is you can have those single code days. If you've got a bit of jump racing in the summer, you can pick a Sunday and just have jump racing, and so that everyone who works in flat racing that day can have a relatively quiet time and a bit of peace for once. But I mean, there's really no question is that we've just got to have less of summer jump racing. It's one of those things, you have to be careful with it anyway, don't you, summer jumping, because, you know, unless you pour loads of water on, which is a risk in itself, you know, you're risking fast ground, which is a sort of potential threat to the welfare of the horse and the jockey if they happen to fall. And then, you know, are we living up to our responsibilities on ecology if we're watering all that much? And then racing these horses in high temperatures. You know, there are just various risk factors that I would be quite comfortable about reducing the whole summer jumping thing.
But Maddy, isn't this a case where the solution is really obvious? I think Chris is right. You know, you don't need to get rid of summer jumps entirely, but clearly, if we took the schedule down to a level more like what it was like around the turn of the millennium, then we would see field sizes rise. It's just a no-brainer.
Yeah, Chris is very diplomatic, but I'm going to sort of chuck in there and go, it's so simple. You know, we talk about staff retention, you're giving those staff a break, you're giving them a chance to do other things. You're making racing more competitive, which therefore makes it more attractive to bet on. Summer jumping is not something that I think grabs everyone. You know, I don't pay as close attention to it as I do the jumping in the winter or during the flat season. So it's just obvious, as you say. And when someone like Fergal O'Brien, who is leading the Trainers' Championship, who is actually benefiting from this, can go, well, hang on, it's not for the greater good of the sport. We need to look long term, which, crikey, we should have been doing, as Craig said, 10, 12 years in the making. When he's saying that, that just proves there's a problem. To me, there are so many pluses, and I'm just disappointed that once again this is sort of symbiotic of racing's failed leadership.
Yeah, one of the things that really sort of frustrates me as well, and this is kind of a professional frustration and kind of as a fan of racing, is just the difficulty with which we encounter trying to get anyone within a position of power in racing to actually comment on the issues we're highlighting now. Now, you guys both know this, you know, you get asked to pick up a story and you do a ring around all day and trainers will talk about it, bookmakers will talk about it, fans will talk about it, but trying to get someone in the corridors of power to stick their head above the parapet and take a view on something is almost impossible.
Yeah. Well, and because none of their colleagues are doing it, you know, so I think individually they all sort of feel, why should I be the patsy?
But that's their responsibility, isn't it?
Is it?
I would argue so.
I think it is. You need leadership to have a vision and a courage of convictions. Now, I understand you cannot constantly lead in public. You can't constantly be commenting on in public. But also, you know, the perception of leadership is important as well. You know, if others in the sport, and it's not just followers of racing that read our coverage or watch racing on TV, it's also other opinion makers and stakeholders. If they don't see anyone leading and espousing a course of action, then that creates, to me, a vacuum. And I think that's the problem, is what we have in racing, is we have a vacuum of leadership. It's partly structural, and it is, I'm afraid to say, partly personnel.
I think it certainly has been that way. There might be work going on behind the scenes that, you know, necessarily is behind the scenes, trying to build consensus, forge agreements where there has been no agreement in the past. You know, I'm feeling sorry for Julie Harrington that she's been compared to Boris Johnson on this show. I'm sure that's not flattering. I'm prepared to give her a chance.
I was referring to the collective leadership rather than Julie in particular. I agree. Well, I would never.
That's a helpful clarification.
I would never.
I'm sure she'd be grateful.
An individual to Boris Johnson apart from Boris Johnson. I think that's beyond the pale, perhaps. This problem.
Yeah, fair enough. But so now, look, I'm prepared to give her and her team, you know, a few months to sort of advance this idea that we can get some sort of collective strategy together, because she hasn't had that long in the job and it's been tempestuous so far.
But confidence is so low, isn't it? Because we're so used to delaying and not delivering. It would just be great if we could see some proactivity. From my point of view, I would love to see some real direction, and, you know, this is where we want to be and this is the time in which we're giving ourselves to achieve it. Yeah. Rather than just, well, we're turning some screws behind the scenes.
We are going to need something fairly soon, aren't we? Yeah,
and you know, you said Julie Harrington's not been in the job for that long. It's well over a year now. You know, they're clearly a very different leadership style to her predecessor, Nick Ross. But I think one thing which Nick certainly had, love him or hate him, and certainly he inspired both within the sport, was that he was always willing to espouse a viewpoint. Now, one of the problems with the BHA is we know actually the BHA doesn't have that much power. So
I think we need to say that as well. You know, this is not it's very easy for us to sit here and go, this isn't good enough, but we have to talk in the context of how racing actually operates, and there isn't a straightforward solution.
No, there's not. Yeah.
I mean, and so that lack of power, okay, you can complain about it, but I mean, would we be happy in an alternative scenario where they had all the power and they were able to just go zap and suddenly Stratford's got no fixtures left? This would be the right way to do it if only we could trust all of racing's different factions and constituent members to come together and actually, using a certain amount of goodwill and imagination, come to some kind of agreement that was for the benefit of all. There's very little form in the book to believe in that kind of outcome. But maybe there's a chance, because we do have lots of new leaders of various trade bodies in racing. There's a chance there.
They talk a good game. I have to say this, and I have no doubt that the people involved in running racing have good intentions. I should say that, and they're often good people as well, effective people. Yeah. But the problem is they can talk a good game and they can say that they're going to approach the problems consensually and they're going to find solutions and we're going to have a long-term strategy. But the simple reality is, time after time after time, these strategies founder on one point, which is that if you cannot agree a common position, then you don't have an agreement.
Right.
Yeah. And that is the Gordian knot of racing governance. Okay, so we come to the exciting point at the end where I determine what goes on the front page. Last week I absolutely scandalously chose my own story, so I'm just going to rule that out straight away, so I don't get a reputation as a dictator.
Funny. Lee always did that as well. Interesting.
I think, Chris, your story is hugely important. Maternity leave and generally the way the sport treats people wanting to have families and the stable staff is hugely important. But as a newspaper editor, I'm going to have to go with Rob Hornby's redemption arc. It was a great story, and it had so many different angles to it, whether the Tory links and also the subplot of what's been happening with the Tory. Just a great story, and it really lit up the weekend for me. That's a wrap for this week then, but do tune in next week when Lee Mottershead will be back in the hot seat, and we're expecting the long-awaited British Whip review to drop this week, so tune in because it should be interesting. Please do also check out the description on the video, because there you'll find a link to subscribe to Members Club Ultimate for 50% off your first 3 months. Members Club Ultimate is our top tier subscription package, giving you access to all the brilliant journalism the Racing Post produces, alongside top tipping, race replays, race analysis, and lots more. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next week.